Tio is one of those characters where, because of the way she's portrayed, you're kind of set up to not expect that much from her. I mean, up until only a few episodes ago, her impact as a core character has seemed rather minimal. Like, we know she's a dragonman and we know that's pretty rare, but other than that, there isn't too much else to her. So, just like how we did with Shia, allow me to provide a bit more depth to her. There isn't nearly as much backstory as there was with Shia, but I feel like knowing who she is and how she got here will help you appreciate her character a little bit more. She actually carries quite a lot more weight than you would expect. So, if we go back to episode 9 of season 1, then you'd probably remember how Tio had been tasked with investigating the appearance of some mysterious summons. Visitors from another world whose presence preceded such an immense output of mana that even the hidden dragonmen couldn't remain ignorant as to why they were brought here. What the anime unfortunately didn't show us though was a closer look into the tragic events of Tio's childhood. A brief yet revealing extra chapter which detailed exactly how her noble lineage was almost hunted to extinction. So, going back over half a millennia, the beginning of her story is what marks the end of her people. It was a grim night in which her entire hometown and the once beautiful capital of the dragonmen was being invaded and destroyed. What made this particular city more special than most wasn't just the dense population of dragonmen, but also the hub for peace that it represented. You see, up until recently, many different races were able to live here together. It didn't matter whether you were demon, demi-human, or human because there was no discrimination or persecution here. That being the case, the fact this once peaceful nation was now being burnt to the ground was something that Tio simply couldn't understand. She could only watch in bewilderment as her people were slaughtered and country led to ruin. And as much as she wanted to go down there and fight alongside them, she was more than well aware that she was far too powerless to do anything. So instead, the most she could do was watch from above and despise her own weakness. It was only a little bit later that the person she feared to lose the most had returned back to safety. The greatest black dragon to have ever lived and the current ruler of all the dragonmen, Karga Claris. Since this giant of a man was Tio's father, it only made sense that he was the person she respected most. But for him to return in the injured state that he was, well, that was a sight that would have shocked anyone. You see, not only was Karga known for being the sturdiest dragon alive, but he was also one of the few that had mastered the art of partial transformation. So, rather than have to turn into a dragon to make use of his wings, he could instead keep himself human and spawn them whenever they were needed, making him much more difficult to fight than all the other dragonmen, especially since his scales were said to be practically impenetrable. In fact, it was his standard tactic of charging in while blocking everything that had granted him the title of Mobile Fortress. So, for him to return with tattered armor, bruises, and a body covered with burns and slashes, well, that just meant his opponents were too much for even him to handle. And if even he wasn't capable of holding them back, then that most certainly meant that no one else could. Of course, that was an idea Tio didn't want to believe was even possible, but her father's words of defeat had pretty much confirmed it. This noble race who were supposed to be the guardians of the world had somehow become a target for extermination. Even with every country and every species owing them for the peace that they created, all of it meant nothing in the face of this new concerted aggression towards them. They may have been the protectors of peace several years ago, but in the short few years since, that image had somehow drastically changed. Now the dragonmen were simply seen as monsters, oppressors that had turned their backs on God, heretics and heathens who could wipe them out whenever. Now, that's not to say their power wasn't something to be feared, but their work as ambassadors for peace should have indicated otherwise. You see, the very fact the dragonmen were stronger than the rest was the very reason they decided to become so noble in the first place. They strove to turn everyone's fear into awe and then ultimately respect, resulting in the utopia-like capital that they had created. It may have taken several centuries to establish, but the end result was a kingdom in which all races were accepted, a global alliance in which all people everywhere were willing to cooperate. That was the foundation the dragonmen had built their nation upon. Despite all they had done to unite the world though, somehow that long-lost fear had managed to take root again. In only a few years, the rest of the world had begun to despise them, resulting in the joint alliance that was invading them now. The reason why still remained a mystery to Tio, but her father made sure to ensure that she understood whose fault it really was. There was more to his return than to simply tell Tio that they had lost. He needed to teach her one last lesson before his time was up. Initially, Tio wasn't aware that that's why he had returned, but it didn't take long for her to realize that this was the last time she'd see him. Any other girl her age wouldn't have been able to see it, but Tio was far more intelligent than her age would indicate. So it wasn't all that hard for her to piece together this gut-wrenching conclusion. That said, even with all the courage she'd shown up until now, Tio still wasn't mature enough to simply disregard the horrid sight she was about to set her eyes upon. It was as her and her father were in mid-conversation that a massive explosion would rock the capital right at its center. It was a blast so powerful only an empty crater was left behind by it. There was nothing left other than ruin and rubble now. But even so, this still wasn't what Tio was so disturbed by. No. The event that went to push Tio past her breaking point was the countless pillars of wood being erected in the aftermath. Wooden crosses that each carried the charred body of a crucified dragonman. So, as Tio watched her people's mangled corpses go up on display, it was the vivid sight of her mother's that made her lose herself. The gentle yet ferocious warrior who had once cared for her was now a lifeless corpse intended to be a warning for the rest of them. Of course, Tio was incredibly enraged by what she'd seen, but she was more so confused as to why her father wasn't doing anything to avenge her. I mean, the sight alone was enough to make Tio's jet black mana emanate uncontrollably, yet here was her father just sitting here doing nothing. That may have been how it seemed to her, but to anyone else it was quite obvious Karga was right where he needed to be. If not for his strong embrace holding Tio tight, then who knows what rash move she would have done to avenge her people herself. So, as he did his best to calm her down, Karga made sure to reinforce what it meant to be one of the dragonmen. Despite this being the fate of their people for now, Karga was certain a time would come when their presence would be needed again. So, in order to ensure that Tio would follow the noble path ahead of her, Karga made her repeat the vow the dragonmen had made with the world numerous centuries ago. It was a mantra that highlighted everything the dragonmen were supposed to stand for, a chant bearing the very last lesson her father would ever give her. Considering the amount of weight that these words carried, it was as soon as they were said that Tio was able to come to a crucial realization. She now understood that if she was to give in to her anger, then all that would amount to was the betrayal of the pride of her people. So, rather than allow her emotions to get the best of her, Tio instead sat quietly and listened closely to what needed to be heard. She had taken her people's principles to heart and used it to quell her anger. As for what her father had to say next, well, the first thing was to clarify who the true enemies were. Yes, the rest of the world was the one attacking them, but they weren't the true enemy Tio had to look out for. As I'm sure you could have guessed already, it was the gods and their devious plans who had made the situation turn out this way. Karga had tried to make a world where the gods were no longer needed, but he simply wasn't fast enough to diminish the heavy reliance the rest of the races had on them, the result of which was the genocide currently taking place before him. Now, because Karga was well aware of just how cunning these powerful gods were, he wasn't so naive as to challenge them without a backup plan. You see, in the unlikely case that something like this did in fact happen, a simple measure was set in place to ensure the survival of his people. It wasn't a plan that could save everyone, but a hidden village was created for a select few dragonmen to live until their time would come again. It was a place so far outside from the main continent that even the path to get there was one that the gods themselves couldn't discover. So this was the place where Tio would go while the rest stayed here. That's not to say that she would be alone, but in order for this plan to work, very few could go along with her. The dragonmen needed to appear as if they were wiped out tonight. If they didn't, then the other races would surely do all they could to find them. That's why Karga had no other choice but to stay and meet the same fate as all the others. That said, there was a small beacon of light to be found in this rather bleak situation. Apparently her late grandfather was already at the village waiting for her. As for how that was possible, well, after the former king had become aware of the god's tendencies to meddle, he decided to work with Karga to form various precautions, one of which was to fake his death then head to the hidden village himself. Of course, the supposed death of the strongest red dragon was nothing short of a tragedy, but it was a necessity to ensure the dragonmen would never truly go extinct. It was their last ploy to give them another chance at freeing the world from its tyrannical rulers. So, with that being everything Karga had to say, his last words were his wife's dying message. A final farewell intended to let Tio know just how special she was. It may not have come directly from her mother herself, but they were words that were sure to stick with her forever. This was Karga's last gift to her before he would fly off and return to the battlefield. Now, if you're wondering how a nation of dragons lost to the invading forces of a bunch of weaker races, well, the reason for that was actually due to their noble lineage. You see, even with all the other races having turned against them, the dragonmen still couldn't bring themselves to truly fight against them. Because killing them would only appeal to the gods who caused this, the dragonmen had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that they didn't kill anyone. They would rather sacrifice themselves than give the gods the satisfaction of the massacre that they likely hoped for. That was the legacy of the dragonmen from so many centuries ago. What remained of them now was a small village located on an island far from the continent, a place where Tio would spend the next half a millennia until the current present we see in the anime. A turning point in time where she could finally stake her life for something great just like how her parents did. After having followed her father's last wish to stay alive, she was now done with simply living and instead ready to pursue the life that she truly wanted. One that could hopefully change the world just like the dragonmen who came before her. But yeah, that's pretty much Tio's backstory. I'm not sure if she gets more in the later volumes of the novels, but as of where we are now, I do believe that's pretty much everything. So, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!